A quiet conversation could be heard through the closed door. Gavin stood outside, waiting patiently. Finally, after about half an hour, the conversation waned. Gavin seized the opportunity and knocked on the door.
Enter.
A gruff male voice commanded from the inside. Gavin opened the door and let himself in. A young man in an NW Bureau uniform, holding a report, nodded at Gavin as he entered, and continued to silently peruse the documents.
Don't mind him, please continue.
The other person in the office was Gavin's father. His expression was exactly as Gavin remembered: furrowed brows, frowning pursed lips, and eyes as cold and steadfast as glaciers. The young man nodded and turned a page of the report.
We believe the persons responsible were also the ones behind the celebration incident and the recent influenza virus outbreak. All the evidence points towards the involvement of Black Swan.
He pointed to the virtual evidence board, and both men examined it for a moment. He raised his hand to continue, but Gavin interrupted him.
And the casualties?
He paused, awaiting the go-ahead from his commander. Gavin's father nodded, and he flipped to the relevant page. He informed Gavin that the casualties were much better than expected, with only 2 seriously injured and no dead. In addition, Ultima Bioresearch had developed a vaccine, so the virus was under control. The young man smiled as he delivered the good news. Hearing this, Gavin relaxed a little, and the young man continued his report for another 15 minutes. Finishing up, he bowed respectfully and left, not forgetting to close the door on his way out. As the door closed, feelings of anxiety and consternation overwhelmed Gavin. It was just the 2 of them now, and he had his father's full attention. Gavin was the first to break the silence.
Special Task Force is looking for Black Swan as well.
His father's face remained impassive, though his eyes narrowed and held a hint of disdain.
And when they find it, they will discover it is nothing but an empty shell.
Empty shells have their uses.
His father shot him a scrutinizing glare.
The evolution accelerator
is not your concern.
They're looking for a suitable evolver to enter the chamber. You know.
Gavin stopped abruptly. His father's piercing stare bore into him.
Are you so eager to find her?
Gavin clenched his fist, trying to suppress his fury. Biting his bottom lip, he met his father's disdainful glare.
I know you're going to send someone to investigate. Let me go. I'm your best option.
Outside the window, stars lit up the dark night sky. Gavin stood at the center of the meeting hall, looking up at the dome. The moon cast mottled patterns of light, like footprints on the ground. Standing next to him was a team of men and women, dressed in NW uniforms. They were whispering nervously to one another about the new mission.
Black Swan is long gone. Are we really going after the Special Task Force? That observation center for excessive evolution sounds suspicious. But is this really necessary?
I'm not sure. You should ask the cap.
The group looked over at Gavin. He seemed unbothered by the attention. Uncertain, they continued to whisper.
They're sending us in to make an arrest.
A worried young man scratched his head.
But what if they arrest us?
The team burst into laughter, and the young man smiled sheepishly.
Relax. They're not going to arrest you.
Gavin hesitated for a second, and was about to continue when a sudden noise was heard outside the door. Everyone froze in place. Gavin placed a finger over his lips.
We've got company.
The clatter of heavy footsteps drew nearer, and it sounded like there were a lot of them. Gavin tensed up, unsure if he could take them out fast enough. With a bang, the door was forced open, and a group of people in white uniforms swarmed into the hall. Confused, each member of the NW team raised their weapon one by one. Then, taking advantage of their confusion, Gavin clenched his right hand into a fist, shut his eyes tight, and tried to ignore the violent winds erupting around him. A cyclone of gales with him at their center blasted through space, tearing at friend and foe alike without reason. The dark winds swept the hall, dislodging the great crystal chandelier above, which came crashing down in the chaos. In the wake of the piercing screams, the howling winds, and the violent destruction, profound silence descended, and darkness engulfed the hall. Gavin grit his teeth, his body tense, and his calm eyes filled with determination. The black tornado surrounded him. He placed a trembling hand on his chest, but showed no signs of stopping it. Only when every person was prostrate on the ground, and the door had been ripped off its hinges, did he release his breath. In the wreckage of the moonlit hall, footsteps could once again be heard in the corridor beyond. These were not orderly footfalls, as the previous ones had been. Seeing the bodies strewn about the floor, Leto raised his hand, and 4 or 5 figures behind him entered the room and began to search the hall. A timid young man at his side erratically scanned the room.
I can't believe we ran right into NW. When they ask...
It was just a misunderstanding. Besides, it appears that both sides took a beating.
Leto glanced at him.
As for Gavin's disappearance, you got an answer for that, too?
The man nodded eagerly. At that very moment, Gavin's body was located. 2 men carried him carefully over to Leto. Leto nodded towards the exit, and they carried him out. The hall fell silent once again. Leto took one last look at the moonlit devastation and turned to leave the room. He awoke to a gentle breeze. The dark mist had cut off all visibility, and movement was impossible. Aside from that faint breeze, he felt nothing. Slowly, Gavin began to regain his senses. He could make out a blurry white light, and voices could be heard nearby.
The evolution accelerator is almost ready. He's a very suitable candidate.
You mean the evolution core? I thought it was already.
He finally managed to open his eyes. Fragments of light came rushing in, and a quiet groan escaped his lips. The conversation ended abruptly. 2 figures, a man and a woman in white lab coats and protective goggles, were looking in his direction. They were holding clipboards as data flashed across the computer screen in front of them. The full scene in front of him came into focus, and Gavin was finally able to take in his surroundings. He was strapped tightly into a white seat. 5 buckles held him firmly in place. He tried to move his head, but found that something was locked around his throat. The man in the lab coat cautiously approached. He appeared to be somewhat pleased with himself. He stood in front of Gavin, blocking his line of sight. Peering down at him condescendingly, he poked the device around Gavin's neck, cocking his head curiously. Gavin frowned and turned his head violently to one side, pushing the man's hand away.
Awake already?
Another needle!
The woman approached with a vial and syringe. Following her movements, Gavin could clearly see what was on the table. Next to the serum was a computer compiling data and a pile of papers, on top of which lay a photo of his very own black glove.
You...
Before he could finish, the needle was inserted into his neck, and the icy, cold serum entered his bloodstream, numbing the pain and dulling his mind. In his confusion, Gavin saw the 2 figures approach again and examine the device on his neck, muttering softly. Their voices became muffled as his mind drifted further and further away. Everything became surreal, submerged in a thick fog which parted to reveal different scenes from his past. He saw a girl clutching a textbook hurrying down a corridor. Leaning against a tree, he watched her disappear into the distance. He watched himself place a bracelet in her hand. The golden ginkgo leaf dangled from her slender wrist. He saw her tears. Her outstretched hand reached for him as she begged him not to leave her. Finally, all the images combined into one, and he saw himself standing at the center of a control room, staring intently at his father.
I have to go.
At that moment, there was only one thought in his mind. He must get her back. He heard a brief sound, and the door was pushed open. Gavin did not bother to see who it was. He sat on the edge of the bed in silence. 2 pairs of black boots appeared in his line of sight. The observers cuffed him and half pushed, half dragged him out of the room. It had been 3 months since Gavin had arrived at the Special Task Force's observation center. Each week, he would undergo 1 eval check, but recently, it had increased to 1 check every 3 days. Still, the increased frequency of these checks had afforded him more opportunities to study his surroundings, and at that point, he understood the layout pretty well. According to NW intelligence, the evolution accelerator was situated somewhere inside the observation center, though Gavin had yet to discover its location. However, Gavin kept pace with the observer ahead, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Many organizations had a tendency to hide their secrets underground, and he wondered if the Special Task Force had fallen into that very trap. He focused his gaze firmly on the ground, as though it could penetrate through to the accelerator. Lost in thought, he accidentally slammed into the observer in front of him.
You!
The observer cried out in pain and turned around, hurling a fist at Gavin. Gavin's eyes flickered, and he moved his head to one side, avoiding the blow. Instinctually, he lifted his shackled hands, smashing the man in the jaw and knocking him to the floor. The other observer, who had been trailing behind, rushed forward to subdue him. Anticipating the attack, Gavin was about to repeat the same move, but remembered his mission and lowered his guard, allowing the observer to push him to the ground. He had forgotten that he had been fitted with a controller, the contraption around his neck. Rubbing his chin, the first observer stood up, his eyes wary.
Freak. Isn't he wearing a suppressor? How did he do that?
Maybe the frequency is too low. Turn it up a bit?
Leaning in close, the observer adjusted the settings on Gavin's controller and let out a sigh of relief.
That should do it. Turned it up all the way.
Gavin lay on the floor, their words coming and going, that indescribable noise in his mind growing louder and louder. The noise stretched his nerves to the breaking point, and his breathing became erratic. The pain ate away at him from the inside out. Indistinct figures entered his field of view. Deep within the snow-capped mountains, mechanical arms flailed under constant gunfire. NW troops surrounded him. He began to hear a girl sobbing. Finally, he saw her face. His heart skipped a beat, as though it were held captive. He struggled to breathe. Gavin lay on the bed, looking up at the white ceiling in the darkness. He closed his eyes and quietly listened to the faint vibrations transmitting in his ear. After a faint beep, the stud earring stopped vibrating, and he opened his eyes. Gavin sat up, blinking, and carefully recalled the message he had just received. The first batch of accelerator subjects has been decided. Your name is on the list. It made sense. More frequent evol checks, stricter monitoring. It appeared that the Special Task Force was just about ready. The stud earring made another sound, interrupting his thoughts. It vibrated intermittently for some time. Gavin gathered his wits and focused again on the vibrations, decoding each one in turn. Has been found. Gavin's eyes widened in disbelief. He lightly held his hand to his right ear to confirm the news. Finally, the stud earring stopped vibrating, and the room fell silent. Gavin sat on his bed, dumbfounded, powerful emotions playing across his face. Yes, it was her. In an instant, joy swept all emotions aside. He touched the cold steel of the stud earring to remind himself that he was not dreaming. It was real, and she was not involved in the evolution accelerator trials. In the darkness, Gavin breathed a long sigh of relief. He looked almost vulnerable, his head buried between his legs and his heart beating like a drum. Suddenly, he recalled the things he saw drifting in and out of consciousness that day. Images of the girl fighting alongside him, putting herself in harm's way for his sake. He had no memory of these events, but for some reason, they felt very real to him. Perhaps they were drug-induced hallucinations. Or perhaps, whatever the case, he would never let it happen again. He would always stand in front of her, protecting her, guarding her, forever.